Welcome back to the October edition of NMRA X. I'm Speed at the bottom of the helix, and today we have a special guest from Rolla, Missouri. Uh, his intro goes like: picture a 12-year-old boy lying on his back under a 4x8 sheet of plywood in his friend's basement, armed with a flashlight and a soldering iron, experiencing model railroad for the first time. Meanwhile, at home, his love of fantasy was growing as he read Lord of the Rings for the first time. In fact, he seriously considered modeling the misty mountain lines of the Middle Earth Railway before his interest in history kicked in and he discovered the East Tennessee and Western North Carolina Railroad. Now, in an attempt to explain how his mutual love of fantasy and history merged to influence the operation on his ET&WNC Vida Division Railroad, please welcome our first clinician of the day from Rolla, Missouri, Dean Smith.
Thank you, Speed, and to everybody who tuned in today. I hope we can all agree that the Misty Mountain Lines would have been a very cool railroad. We could have mining Mithril and Moria, shipping old Toby from the Shire, shipping beer to the Prancing Pony. And to me, what makes good fantasy, like in The Lord of the Rings, is when an imaginary world comes to life in your mind. I recently saw a clinic by John Lawrence, and he contended that by telling stories through scenery, vignettes, and figures, our layouts can take on a life of their own, becoming real railroads in miniature. Now, this is true with prototype railroads, freelance railroads, and anything in between. Now, as scenery was completed and operating sessions became more frequent, my ET&WNC Vida division started to develop its own history without any interference for me at all. It was complete with stories, personalities, nicknames. Well, I decided to embrace this development, and with some creative assistance from my very talented daughter, Becky, the Vida division now boasts excursion flyers, postcards, 2 newspapers, a commemorative coloring book for children of all ages, as well as regular operating sessions. Through discussions that I was fortunate enough to have with retired crew members and other old timers back in the 1980s and 90s, I was struck with the affection for the prototype that just cannot be exaggerated, with some of them holding on to hope that someday the railroad might actually still return, 40 years after the end of the narrow gauge. And during the Depression, an elderly woman was asked why the railroad was so beloved. After a pause, she replied, "Well, it's the onlyest railroad around." There was even a local poem included in the official ICC report to abandon a portion of the railroad that lamented, "The waters rose and took her track. We want our little Tweetsy back." So in the Vida division, what I'm trying to do is recreate this deep connection so I can share my love with this special railroad. Now, not just with the 5/8 of an inch tall inhabitants, but with visitors, friends, and especially the diverse crew members that work the Vida division. So I'm now going to tell this tale using the use of an admittedly fictional scrapbook created by one of her patrons. And again, this is with a little help from my daughter. So there we can see on the scrapbook. So let's delve in and see what we've got. On the first page, we've got an excursion flyer that was specially made for the Vida division by my daughter, based on a prototype one. A funny story about that. When I took that to the printer to be done, they looked at it and they said, Dean, we could clean that font up for you. And I said, you don't understand the time it took my daughter to get it to look like that. That's something I hand out in live clinics when I talk about the railroad. And also you can see there, that's a prototype brochure that the railroad promoted, because the ET promoted tourism throughout the their entire existence. A lot of excursion trains, as people basked in the beauty of the Blue Ridge, and particularly the Doe River Gorge. So here we've got our first entry in the scrapbook. 66 miles of sheer mountainous beauty. So excited to finally ride the Blue Ridge stem winder and do some Kodaking. Doe River Gorge, here I come. And there's a map from the time which shows the railroad. The ET ran from Johnson City, Tennessee to Boone, North Carolina, a distance of 66 miles. And from that, I came up with my own Vida division railroad, which you can see is a 23 by 28 foot room. It's a point by point layout. We run through Johnson City to Boone. And most of the towns, however, are the track work is not based on prototype. Again, when I planned the railroad, I was looking to the operation of the Vida division itself, and what could help make it operate as the best possible model railroad that I could come up with. So here we're at Johnson City, Tennessee. We've got where the adventure begins at the Johnson City Depot. You'll notice sometimes the photographs. I'm not sure exactly why, but the but the gentleman who made this scrapbook chose to take two pictures of a lot of things. So there we have the depot. Map of Johnson City again. There's industries within the yard limit, as well as a as track for sorting cars, which we'll get into, and standard gauge operation. And there you can see one of my backlit control panels, which is how we control the track switches. And there's if you were in the basement, that's a look at east and west of Johnson City. And there we have the depot, and you can see there in the background the Main Street Johnson City, which is again is where I chose not to follow the prototype all the time. Those two buildings where I tried to have the feel for the ET. But for instance, one of those models is Marcy's Mercantile, another is the Rose Hotel. These buildings are named after my granddaughters. And also you can see the number of figures that I like to put in. I really put lots and lots of figures in my layout, again, because it adds to the realism and the feel of vibrancy. As a note, I also put in what my kids call Easter eggs sometimes. You might notice, no one has ever noticed this on their own, but if you'll notice the one gentleman sitting there at the depot looks a lot like my famous historical people from history, looks a little bit like Abraham Lincoln. There's a story behind that, how he could possibly be there in 1925. Again, when my fantasy love kicks in, if you've ever read one of my favorite books on Abraham Lincoln, which is Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, it's one of the few that actually ends happily. Most of the other Abraham Lincoln books all end the same way, which kind of sucks. But now the adventure begins with the gentleman with the scrapbook, where he goes to the yard office and he meets Mr. Hobbs. Clarence Hobbs was the longtime superintendent of the railroad. And here in color, you can see that gentleman is looking at a blue book, which undoubtedly is one of the rule books. So I'm guessing that he's a prospective employee for the railroad, perhaps. And lucky for him, the first thing that happens is he gets invited into the yard office and gets to see the dispatcher's office, where here's his black and white photographs of the layout. And here it is in color. As I tried to make the crew's lives as realistic as possible, I kind of got to deciding that the dispatcher was being a little bit left out. So you can see there's my new dispatcher's office, and it's got everything that he can possibly need. There's a fast clock, there's the phones, there is the window. And if you notice in the upper, there's a miniature TV camera in the yard office. So where the full-size dispatcher sits is exactly where the 5/8 inch tall yard dispatcher would be sitting, and with a complete view of the railroad. That TV is a flat screen TV. A really neat effect. If you're interested in this, there will be an article in this year's HON3 annual on how I built it. And the last important thing on the dispatcher's office, you'll notice that cup right there. I'm a home brewer as well. I have a rule on the railroad that no drinking alcohol during the operating sessions. But my son Steven argued that, well, the dispatcher, he's not really around the trains much. So we have a don't ask, don't tell rule. We call it dispatcher tea. The dispatcher's office is right across the hall from the kegerator. So sort of a don't ask, don't tell thing about what actually goes in that cup. And then, of course, what happens the very first operating session we have with the TV is Tom McKenzie there, who's a longtime operator on the railroad, and he loves being the yard master. if you'll notice there, the very first thing he did was figure out where he could we could spot two boxcars to effectively block the view of the dispatcher from all his nefarious deeds as he switches Johnson City. And it was a hoot. You can see there in the picture, that's all the dispatcher could see. And Tom would leave those boxcars there unless he had to move them to make a move and put them back. So that may be the most prototypic thing that's ever happened on my railroad. I don't know. Got some gifts from the dispatcher. The one there, that blue book, is the rule book, which all employees get a copy of, and it's got the rules of the railroad, a map, instructions on how we switch freight cars, run passenger cars, and a timetable. And then there's a copy of a train order. Again, we try to do things as prototypic as we can. So here's some other examples of train orders. The one on the left is a prototype, and the other three are from the Vida division. And they're replicas of the actual train orders that we use, that are half size. We generate freight traffic using car order cards. I've used this system now for over 20 years and been really happy with it. I have been doing some studying lately and seeing some clinics on NMRA, and I'm definitely going to be looking into that to see if maybe that would be a more prototypic way to handle our freight traffic. But like I said, we've been real happy with the train orders or with the way cards for years. The dispatcher records train movements through this dispatcher's timesheet. Again, low tech, but it is 1925. And there's a schematic of the railroad on the left, and then time flows across the right. And that's keeping track where all of the the placement of each train. And we control train movements through phones. The real railroad used telegraph, but expecting people to be able to use Morse code would probably be a problem. So we use a phone. You can see there the switchboard that's part of the dispatcher's office. And no trains move without dispatcher clearance, which is how we keep track of where everybody is. We use a fast clock of 6 to 1, really like those analog clocks from GLM Enterprises. We run about, an operating session usually lasts about a little over 2 hours. So we run a 12-hour day and in a little over 2 hours. Controlling, I use Digitrax to control the locomotives. I just got that new UT6D yesterday. I've tried it out a little bit. We're going to have our first operating session post-COVID on next Friday. I'm really excited about that. But the wireless has helped out a lot. As you'll see in some pictures later, the aisles tend to get a little crowded. So not having to plug in your throttles at least cut down a little bit on the torquing. And I also use a PM42, which has helped a lot by dividing the railroad into 4 different sections. Another gift from the dispatcher is a timetable. Just like the railroad ran passenger trains by timetable. The freights are all run as extras. And I tried to reflect the time and the actual passenger action where train leaves. One train leaves Boone, Johnson City in return. The other Johnson City, Boone in return. And actually the times worked out relatively similarly as well. And that's here's a picture of my passenger crane crew. That's my daughter Becky running a train. And when I first came up with the train with passenger trains, to be honest with you, basically I was just looking at a way to make the freight train crews a little more complicated and give the dispatcher more to do. But as the railroad has developed this enthusiasm and life of its own, I'm finding that the passenger train crews have become a really popular job. And again, it's pretty simple. It's a good way to rail fan the railroad, and I never have a problem filling my passenger crew list. And there's a pictures of the number 2, passenger train number 2, getting ready to leave Johnson City on a beautiful summer day. And there from the scrapbook, we see again pictures of a train going across the covered deck truss bridge headed toward Hampton. Johnson City Hostler is another job that we have on the railroad. That gentleman there's name is Southbound, Gary Southbound Micah. Another thing we find on the railroad is people end up nicknames. He'd been to the house many times, but ended up driving 15 miles south once, and so he's became southbound. And there you can see we're coaling a locomotive there at the transfer trestle and getting water at the tank. Both of those are prototype from the railroad. And there's a picture of the engine house again, uh, where the engines are stored. And we do have a maintenance crane. That The model of that was built by my friend Brad Sloan, who built it and ended up winning a national NMRA contest with it, and then gave it to me. So it's always a good thing to have friends like Brad. But we do use the maintenance crane for not in a minor derailments. We'll just put the cars back on the track. But if we have something major, which you'll see in a little bit, we definitely do pull out the crane and have a work crew. And there's color pictures of those scenes. And the sand house. A lot of times people see if you see a picture of or if you see models of the ET and WNC, you might comment on how the locomotives don't seem very weathered. But throughout its history, the railroad really took great care of their locomotives, a lot of pride. And Andy Kern was one of the keys to that. He was a decades-long employee of the railroad and responsible for the upkeep of them a lot. And there you can see him. In the upper left is actually climbing aboard the number 5 for sand. Um, could not find any information anywhere on how ashes were taken care of on the prototype. So again, for the Vida division, I just freelanced an interesting looking ash pit that would make sense for where we're at. So there's where the ashes are taken care of. Now, big job is the Johnson City yard master, and a lot happens at Johnson City. There you can see in the corner where he gets cards. The yellow cards, those are switching moves within the yard, and then the others, of course, are empties that are that will need to be they're orders that will need to be filled with new cars, and that's one of his big jobs is to collect cars there. And then again, back to the scrapbook, we saw transferring coal from standard gauge to narrow gauge hoppers. One of the things that's really added a lot of interest to the railroad is the dual gauge operation that we now have, and there's a color version of that. And the railroad transferred coal and liquids, a lot of times gasoline, and there was a 6-inch tube that all we can figure is they actually like put the tube up, turned on the valves, and let gravity do its work. I'm guessing at least there was a rule, no smoking while we're transferring gasoline, but it was certainly before OSHA. And the iron furnace, one of the main reason the railroad existed was to haul ore from Cranberry, North Carolina to Johnson City. And this was a picture of the iron furnace, the Carnegie iron furnace that was there. I had a little bit of a problem with that. And then there's a picture of, and on the left is my S-scale furnace from my friend John Waite that now, upon John's unfortunate death, his wife Sharon donated that model to the ETSU Carter Museum in Johnson City, where it's proudly displayed there. But I needed this big furnace and didn't have much room for it. So what I did was I took a picture of John's model, and there on the right, that's simply a photograph of the furnace against my backdrop, and I build a little hill up to it and curve the track around, and it makes a really nice illusion and gives me a major industry for the railroad that takes up no room. Again, the yard master's big jobs is making up the narrow gauge freight. You see also there's Exum Furniture, which is another big industry on the railroad, and cars are made up there. And now here back to we see a side-by-side look at the different gauges and the excitement that they switch standard gauge cars with narrow gauge engines. Now, I just always love the difference in sizes of narrow and standard gauge cars. And this is where the standard gauge freight is staged above the dispatcher's office. And so the way that it operates on the railroad is at the beginning of an operating session, there's usually about a half a dozen standard gauge cars set it out in Johnson City. And then one of the yard master's jobs is to collect those cars up into a block. Then the freight comes in, and of course they switch out, and then the new cars are spotted based on by that switch list there in the corner. So I just love these pictures. That here you can see that little engine doing its work of the big cars, and the real ET, the prototype, had standard gauge couplers mounted at standard gauge heights on all the cars, and then the locomotives had a swivel coupler. Whereas I opted, for obvious reasons, I adapted my standard gauge fleet has narrow gauge couplers at narrow gauge height because that was only a couple dozen cars to have to do. And it's really cool because using a pick, you can switch those cars with narrow gauge engines. So we don't need to use idler cars. And that adds a huge amount of interest and fun to the Johnson City operation. And now Cy Crumley certainly was a gentleman, and here he's a longtime employee of the railroad. And there you can see him posing by Combine 15, which was a fascinating car. The railroad, it was a three-way combine. It was one third passenger, one third baggage, and one third RPO. And then you can see where he's this gentleman photograph the freight conductor's train book. And that's an actual 100% identical piece of the document from the prototype. A member of the Historical Society came across a train book from the 20s, and it was about half filled out and half not. So we were able to research it to see how it was filled out, and then photocopy the blank pages. So the document that my freight crews use is 100% just absolutely what the prototype did. So that's a nice little wrinkle. And there's a picture of some of my crews. You see, I live in South Central Missouri. There are not a whole lot of model railroaders around me. So I've got a very, very diverse crew. In fact, the majority of my crew aren't model railroaders at all. They're just friends of mine that I've talked into coming over and seeing what it's like to bring the Vida division to life. And as you can see there's all different ages and all different experience levels. And don't sell little kids short. Carter there's 10. And I tell you what, he's learning quick, and he knows what he's doing, and he takes his job as right there. He's being a freight crew, and he needs some help with the switching moves, but he takes it seriously. And there we've got a picture of the freight leaving Johnson City, headed for Hampton and the Gorge and other parts. We can't pass across this bridge without talking a little bit about the Great Wreck of 19. One of the cool things with operating sessions is you never know when something might happen to add to the lore and history of your railroad. Normally those don't happen, but for instance, this was a major day. They still talk about it in the mountains, where the Great Wreck of 19 happened when Tom McKenzie, a new hire to the railroad, was switching Johnson City, and didn't realize that the standard gauge track ended at the bridge. So he took those standard gauge cars onto the bridge, and you can see the catastrophic accident that happened. Now, as reported in the Johnson City Chronicle, the union went to bat for him, and he was actually got all back pay and was reinstated, because, believe it or not, the management did not have that end of that standard gauge rail with signage, as you can see now in the lower right. That has certainly now been added, but the only thing that happened to Tom McKenzie out of this whole thing was he ended up with his nickname, and he will forever be known in the Vida division as Short Rail. And now we're going into Hampton, and you can see there with the freight conductor's train book, where we're going to be dropping off some cars, and dropping off and picking up cars. They're always marked by milepost numbers. And there's a station. There's the map of Hampton again, designed to add interest to the railroad. There's some pictures of Hampton. You see on the left there, you might recognize that. That's a fine scale miniatures kit that I rubbed my daddy's back for like 90 minutes when I was a kid, before I could drive, to talk me into going to the hobby shop to buy that. And then that gas station on the right, my grandfather built that station, and actually it was in Independence, Missouri. And my mom grew up there. So I already had these models when I decided to model the ET. Again, I decided that while they're not specific ET models, they definitely, fill the need for operation, and they have the right feel. So they proudly exist on the Vida division. And a few more pictures of switching Hampton. And then we're leaving Hampton. I don't know how that photographer managed to get that picture there on the on in the bridge. I certainly hope he wasn't hurt. But now we're headed into the Doe River Gorge. And look, he got to meet Bob Richardson. Bob Richardson was a well-known photographer that took a that chronicled a lot of the ET for several years, and that may explain why some of these pictures on the in the scrapbook could not possibly have been taken on this trip. So I guess they're ones he swapped with. And there we see a black and white picture of entering the Doe River Gorge. One thing I really wanted to do with the railroad is I wanted to get a feel like you were really going somewhere. So the trip through the gorge is actually it's 37 uninterrupted feet, um, and basically just rail fanning. So there's some pictures again, panoramic pictures of going through the gorge, um, most primitive gorge in the eastern United States. And there's action there. You see there on the right, that's Party Point, where a lot of all passenger trains stop for Kodaking. At least all the excursion trains did. And then that gentleman on the left, I'm not sure exactly who he is, but I made him promise he will never say "You shall not pass" when a train goes by. So I let him stay, and there hasn't been any problems. Again, you never know when something might happen to cause a story. Yes, Virginia, there really is a reason for Rule 19. Rule 19 states eastbound trains are limited to a total of 6 freight cars, not to include the hack, and had a new engineer who decided on a mixed train, decided to sneak 8 cars through the gorge. And you can see exactly what happened. That rule really exists for a reason. And we had a string line. And once again, we had to bring out the maintenance crew and get it sorted out. It didn't take us as as long in real life, but it we still had to take care of it. And again, Kodaking at Party Point, big excitement there on railroad. You can see we got a picture of that going on, and hopefully those guys are firm-footed because it's a 70-foot drop there to the Doe River, and the scenery is breathtaking. And there's a couple more pictures of trains going through the gorge. I obviously still have some few more trees I got to add. And headed toward the bridge tunnel bridge. Most iconic things of the railroad in the gorge. The Doe River makes a horseshoe turn, and the railroad in just a matter of a couple hundred yards, bridges, tunnels, and then bridges again as it goes across the Doe. So there's a picture of the deck truss bridge. And this again must be a picture from Bob because it's going in the wrong direction. But this train is going across the other bridge into the tunnel. And there it is going in the direction we're traveling right now. And there's some color pictures of the bridge tunnel bridge. And then we're headed into Cranberry. Cranberry is a big operation, hotspot on the railroad, milepost 34. See there we're getting water. And there's the map. Now, unlike all the other towns, Cranberry is operated the way, is designed the way the real railroad is. There's an upper yard and then a switchback and a lower yard. So a lot of switching there. This is where the home of the mine is. And there's some pictures, again, panoramic. You can see I don't have all my structures built yet, but I tell you what, those doing those mock-ups is a big, big help because it really adds to the realism to even have the models done that far. And there's Brad Sloan, who loves being the Cranberry yard master. And the way that this yard operates now is Brad does the switching down below, or whoever the yard master is, and then we'll take a cut of cars for the eastbound and a cut of cars for the westbound freights, who then just switch out cars at the upper level. And this is an example of how things changed to meet the needs of the railroad. Because when we first operated, every train, it was just sort of a free for all at Cranberry. It just didn't work. So again, at an after operating session, we all talked about the ways to deal with it. And, again, just like a real railroad, we made decisions based on the efficient movement of traffic. And there's pictures of the depot and the general store. And had a little personality there, a little yummy egg salad sandwich with a nice juicy pickle. Cheerwine and moon pies are famous in the area, and everybody knows what a moon pie is. A cheerwine is, well, let's just say it's an acquired taste, but a lot of people in North Carolina like it. And then there's the mine, that kind of funky looking building in the middle that looks like Dr. Seuss might have designed it to put on Mulberry Street. That's the concentrator. And it was a metal drum that crushed the ore to pea size. And then the tailings fell down below. And then an arm came up and scraped the iron off of the drum onto another conveyor to a different tipple. So I'm able to model that, and the two different sidings. And I also have an ITT sound system under there, sound module, so I can play the concentrator. Those are fun, but we don't use them during operating sessions because it just gets a little bit too much. And then some pictures of switching Cranberry, both the upper and lower level, and a picture of the depot and the general store. And again, I put a lot of figures in my scenes because it just really, pops them to life. Now, passing in between Cranberry and Linville, you see there's a fill there, and it's a brand new looking fill, and there's a reason for that. When the railroad bought the Linville River Railway, there was a lot of trestles on the railroad that they filled with tailings from the mine. And so you see there, they lamented that the Linville trestle was spectacular. It's a shame it will soon be nothing but a fill. In fact, one of the jobs of the Cranberry yardmaster is that sometime during operating session, he takes 2 cars of tailings. Of course, he needs the dispatcher's clearance because he's on the main, and spends 30 scale minutes on the trestle, dumping the tailings to help fill the trestle. Now there you can see I'm modeling it in the process of being filled. There's the culvert down there. Now, trust me, there are hundreds of those little nut bolt washer castings on that bridge. So this thing ain't never really going to get filled in. But it's a good way because I love trestles, to have the trestle, but also to tell the story of the railroad as they fill it in. Headed into Linville, milepost 46. There's again the train conductor's freight book. Those of you old timers might recognize that track arrangement. That is, yes, indeed, that's a time saver switching puzzle made famous by John Allen. We don't operate it as the game, but I often consider getting rid of it because it's obviously not very prototypic. But my crew loves it, and when they're not cussing it, and it's also it's cool the way that people figure out shortcuts and different ways to make to block cars either at Cranberry and Shoals Mills in anticipation of Linville. And I once had a new operator who really struggled there, but he got through it. And he said, and I explained some hints, and he said, "Well, yeah, that just takes experience." And I said, exactly. That's what is so cool about it, is that, as just like on a real railroad, as your operators, have more experience, they learn the shortcuts. And fortunately, all my people are very, very willing to share their ideas, both good and bad, with new people. And there's some pictures of Switch and Linville. That the depot down there is covered with chestnut bark. As a cool story about that, it was when the railroad went out of business in 1940, it ended up being a private residence. And then in 2009, I believe, it was going to be torn down, and with a really cool group of interested parties, including our historical society, got together and saved the building and moved it to the Avery County Museum in Newland, North Carolina, where it has been completely restored as a museum. Obviously, it's got poplar bark instead of chestnut bark, because chestnut bark doesn't exist anymore. And also the Caboose 505 is sitting right next to the depot where it used to be. So if you ever get in that area, it's definitely worth a look. It's a beautiful, beautiful building. And now we've got some rural area between Linville and Shoals Mills. You pass in some, again, breather in the scenery, no switching, just some rail fan looking. And then, oh my goodness, move over cow. We have places to go. During the excursion trains and the prototype, a lot of times a cow would happen to find its way on the track. And so, but every once in a while, if I'm in an ornery mood, I'll set a cow out too, just for fun. But I mean, it certainly did happen in real life, but not nearly as often as they like to pretend it did. And again, there's a farm along the way. The first book I ever bought, it was Easy to Build Model Railroad Structures, and it had that farm in it. And I fell in love with that farm when I was a kid. and I decided that I was going to model it someday. And there you can see again, it's mocked up. Those little chickens in the corner, they move. They're like caffeinated, but it's a hoot and holler. They peck really really fast, and I hate to admit that the two things that get the most comment on my layout. One is the obviously the dispatcher's window, and the other is them chickens. So they definitely keep things a humming. Now we're in Shoals Mills, milepost 58. Again, you see the switching that's done there. Shoals Mills is the home of the Boone Fork Lumber Company sawmill. And there's the map again of it, just some passing siding and some switching. There's a picture of my model. It's a board by board construction, interiors all done. Um, it's a big industry for the railroad. I wanted to have sound in that model, and when I built it, it was before the ITT things were available. So what I did was I've got an old VHS tape of the last Oregon steam powered sawmill and hooked that up to my cassette player, and I just simply kept pushing, pause and play, and then there's a automobile tape recorder underneath the layout with that cassette. And when I turn it on, it plays the cassette. Works out really well, and I can put any cassette in it I want. So, truth be known, like for instance, Simon and Garfunkel has had a concert there, but I mean, usually it's just the sounds. And there's some pictures of it. We're switching Shoals Mills, and then headed toward Boone, the end of the line. You see, I haven't finished the water yet, but that's the splash dam to make the log pond as we head into Boone. And Boone, North Carolina is the end of the line. See, all the little check marks are done. Um, Boone is the home for the Appalachian State Teachers College. So you can see there's a postcard of one of the buildings and my mock up of my soon to be built administration building for the college. And there's the map of it. You can see there's a Y for turning trains. And also, there's a reverse loop in there where we don't use it during operating sessions. But if I want to, I could run a loop to loop uh, such situation. The other advantage to doing it that way was by having the tail of the Y into the backdrop, I was able to swing Boone far enough up that I was able to have room for the rest of the town. So there, and then we're at the end of the line. There's some pictures of Boone, that lumber company railroad, or that lumber yard right there. LMS Lumber and Building Supply. That was based on it's an E.L. Moore structure from the very first model railroader I ever bought in April of 1973. And so again, I had that model finished when I decided to model the ET. Again, it was pretty much a no-brainer to decide I was going to include it. And again, it's named after my father, so it's got a lot of personal meaning to me as well. And then some things we do to make the railroad more realistic, like I mentioned before. My daughter helped me do this. On the right, there is an actual, that's a prototype postcard from probably the late 20s, early 30s. And then the other postcard is from the Vida division. See, my daughter used Photoshop and to make it look more like it's a colorized black and white picture, and I hand those out again to visitors, and I hand those out at clinics and things like that. Now below, you see, you can find a interest group for anything, and there is an interest group on post offices in North Carolina, and that postmark is an exact replica of the actual postmark that was used in the Combine 15 car that I mentioned earlier. And train 2 means it was from the train that ran from Johnson City to Boone. And so I give out the postcards, I send them to people, but the only way to get a postmarked postcard is to actually to be a member of the crew on the railroad. So if you ever make it to Vida, Missouri, I hope you do, and work an operating section on the Vida division, you'll be given a piece of cardboard. But it will be a piece of cardboard with an actual postmark from the Combine 15. And like I was mentioning earlier, kind of I'm summing it up, the Vida division, it has taken on a life of its own. It's got its own history and traditions. And in short, my goal is that it becomes a real railroad in miniature, and trying to get, the enthusiasm and love that the people for the real railroad instilled in my crew. And again, you can see there people of all ages and interests. Down in the corner, little Christopher there, he's 5. And my last operating session before COVID, we had the weather turned bad, but of course Mackenzie came all the way from St. Louis. But they paired up, and Tom spent the operating session teaching Christopher how to work Johnson City. And I mean, he was on it just the whole time. So again, as we look at ways to get young people involved in our hobby, I think we really need to make sure we don't sell them short. But again, everybody's smiling, and that's the goal of what we do. Here's another picture, shows again how crowded everybody is, but again, they still look happy. But this right here is one of the things that caused us to decide to change, our operating systems, because plans, because it was just getting too crowded. Which again, we had a after operation meeting, and what can we do? And that's we started, kicking around ideas, and developed the yard masters, divided the jobs up differently, and so it tends to be a little bit crowded. But again, it's the smiles on the faces are what mean the world to me. I'm also a home brewer, as I mentioned. So one of the most, sometimes people joke they're the reason they come. I hope that's not all. But after the workday, we always have a talk session. You can see I model 1925, which is during the Prohibition, but you can still see Brakeman's Best Brewing Company. That's the name of my son and my brewery. You see where they kind of half behind painted out brewery with cheap white paint so it would wash off. But, and I'm sure those two gentlemen there in the corner are only enjoying some non-alcoholic root beer product. And then on the right, that's the infamous kegerator that's right across the hall from the dispatcher's office. And there's some of the beers that Stephen and I have made over the years. And we always have a non-alcoholic root beer as well, homemade. So in fact, I just finished that the other day. It's now being carbonated, so it'll be ready for Friday when we have our first operating session. This train is bound for glory. The brakeman has resigned. I'd like to thank you for attending my clinic. There's my information. I do have a few thanks that I'd like to give out since I have a couple of minutes left. Contributors to this, my wife Sandy, we took advantage of her third grade teaching skills, and we call her wordsmith. She's the one who did the writing on the scrapbook. And then that little Marcella, she's 7 months old. And when I was practicing this clinic, she sat there like that the whole time, and didn't fuss until I was done. So there's again, hopefully I got a budding new little model railroader in the works. And then my daughter Becky, who did all the Photoshop magic. That's a picture of her. Um, at 3 years old, helping me with the sawmill, and then about a year ago, doing her best Hermione Granger impersonation as she elevates the sawmill out so I could work on it. She originally refused to take any money for it, but then we found this check from the ET. And came across the fan site, and she was able to work her name into that. So instead of not nothing, she's getting paid $151.52. And amazingly, that September 5th, 1925 date was not changed. And I model 1925, and the first time I gave a clinic with this scrapbook was September 5th in Hickory, North Carolina. So that's pretty amazing. And then she needed a picture of me, the last job, since I was talking about the different jobs on the railroad. That's me. We've all heard that before. Let the dang thing jump the track and see who catches hell. And Becky said I needed to put a picture of my best side on there, so I did. You can tell I designed the railroad a whole lot when I was younger than I am now, but I was able to make that stretch and get all those trees in. So Anyway, I'm going to go back up to this slide there so you have my contact information. I hope you enjoyed your trip on my railroad. I've certainly enjoyed presenting the clinic. I want to thank Speed for giving me this opportunity. I'm starting to learn more about NMRAX myself, and actually watched a couple. I did one on JMRI just the other night. So thanks again, and I guess we're going to open ourselves up for questions pretty quick because I am 30 seconds away from my mint time. So thank you all very much, and I hope you enjoyed my clinic.
First question, what year is your layout set in?
1925, although some of the compromises that I make are temporal as well. You might have noticed the picture of the TOFC car. The ET may very well have been one of, if not the first, one of the first railroads to ever use piggyback cars, and they existed in 1935. So I did some temporal. I wanted that on my railroad. Also at Cranberry, for instance, there's the turntable there. We know that turntable was gone by 1910, but I included it there. But overall, my time is 1925.
And you added the narrow gauge because it was there?
Well, the railroad is narrow gauge. I mean,
Okay.
the railroad is entirely narrow gauge, except for, sorry if I didn't make that clear. The standard gauge is only at Johnson City. The
Okay.
ET&WNC was a narrow gauge layout or railroad. Apologize if I didn't make that clear.
So early on, you showed your waybills and car cards.
Mhm.
I noticed that there were some colors on some of them. Is there any
Oh,
importance to that?
absolutely, yes. They designate where they a red line means that that car is not going to leave that yard limit during the operating session. So,
Okay.
for instance, moving the tailings from Cranberry to the Trestle and back. That would be marked red. Like taking an empty tank car from the sorting yard at Johnson City and then moving it to underneath the transfer trestle to be filled with gasoline. That would be an inner yard movement. So that's what those red means. And then the green lines are passenger cars.
Okay. Okay. Now, your operators are old, sorry, experienced enough to operate that dial on the phone that you showed?
Oh no, no, that the dial, my daughter found that phone and the dial doesn't actually operate. There's a switchboard that is used when an operator picks up the phone, a light lights up on the switchboard. There's also, I didn't mention it, but if you look on that, there is a out of station phone as well. So if you have a problem if you need to contact the dispatcher and you're not in a town, there is an out of station phone. But before you can use it, you have to allow 10 scale minutes because that's the time it takes to get the telegraph kit out of the cab of the locomotive and shinny up the telegraph pole and call in.
Cool.
If anybody is really interested in the next HON3 annual, like I mentioned, there's an article on that entire dispatcher's office, including how I did the window and the circuitry and how that phone works. And that's a great system. It was devised by a friend of mine named Bob Woodley, and it's a very usable, very very good system for using phones on a railroad.
Now, you've shown pictures of all kinds of people operating your layout.
Mhm.
How do you manage them having different skill levels, or how do you balance the layout?
Okay.
Um,
I can keep 10 people busy on the layout. So a lot of times what I'll do is our freight crews are 2 people because of the paperwork that's done with the freight conductor's train book. So usually what I will do is I'll put an inexperienced person with an experienced person on a freight
okay.
train,
Okay.
or like passenger trains. Again, that's more rail fanning. It's a lot easier to run a passenger train. And then dispatcher is a pretty tough job. I got a friend of mine, never been a model railroader. He came just because he likes me. And after the first session, he said, about half an hour into it, he says, "Dean, I'm going to have to leave." I said, aren't you having a good time? He said, but my knees, I can't stand up this long anymore. Well, bingo. He ended up being our dispatcher apprentice. And so now Mark, that's of course, and he also gets dispatcher tea during the session. But that's become his job of choice because he can sit down during it.
Cool. So do you rotate your operators' positions, or do they get to do the same thing over and over?
I have a seniority system, and which is there's a story behind that too, where it's a kind of a long story. But one of the things you have to do to get your seniority point in order to be a real ET session, according to my friend Ken Riddle, is the first one I had back in 2002. I mentioned that we had this operating session. I got on the e groups or what I was called then, and he said, Dean, if people weren't drinking, if there wasn't at least one preacher, and if people didn't spend their whole time peeing and moaning that the conditions were better on the clinch field or the Southern, then it wasn't a real ET operating session. So I said, well, we didn't drink during the session, and we did have one preacher while he was in seminary time, but no one complained. So he said, forget it, it didn't count. So one of the things you must do in an operating session on the Vida division is you have to at least once find something to complain about. Believe me, it's not hard to do. That things were better on the clinch field of the Southern. And then if you, once that happens, you get a seniority point. So we do have a seniority list. Usually, though, we just get together and we talk about it, and people are very willing to definitely, I've got people that, like Short Rail loves working Johnson City. Brad loves Cranberry. But they're more than willing to switch around. So we don't do it formally. But we've never had a problem with anybody getting their feelings hurt or
Okay.
anything about what job they do.
So do you still have the presentation up? Because someone's asking if you could show the track plan again.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. I'm going as fast as I can. A long way back. Might be a quicker way to do this, but okay. Now we're doing the return trip.
There are trains going that way too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Now in fact, in my one clinic with a guy, if you notice where he had ate the egg salad sandwich, and the reason we put that in there was because in the rail fan he didn't have any pictures on the way back, and that's because he got tummy distress. So it's sort of a joke in the one clinic, but almost there. Almost there. Okay, here we go. Almost there. Come on there. Almost there. There we go. There we go. And now I don't show it, but and where it says West Johnson City, there's a reverse loop in that room. That's where the dispatcher's office is. So the dispatcher sits in that room at a desk with the trackware going above him.
And then he has a computer screen or a TV monitor where you can see that camera.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that's just a window. It's
Correct.
it's nothing but, it's the exact same scene that the 5/8 of an inch tall dispatcher would have if he sat in the yard office. So
Okay.
it's really cool. I mean, I tell you, I mean, it adds nothing to the operation. But it is so fun to sit there and watch the trains move in real time. It's just it really adds a lot.
And then someone wants to know who painted your figures.
I did. What I do is I first spray them with gray, like Tamika, is that how you pronounce it? Primer. Let that dry at least several days, and then I use washes of. I'm old enough, and I guard it like Schmaw guards his treasure, my Floqual paints. But you better believe it. But I don't paint them. I like flow the color onto them over that gray, and then after that I hit them with a coat with a black India ink wash,
Uh-huh.
and then spray them with Tester's dull coat, and then go over them with chalks.
Okay.
A shiny figure just doesn't do it, and those chalks make sure that they're dull. So now
So a few more.
my backdrops were painted by my friend Sharon Waite. That's the
Okay.
only thing on the railroad I didn't do myself.
few more quick questions, and then we
Sure.
want people to go over, if you're willing, to the werby.com/MRL Aussies.
Yeah,
To
that's the
ask more
one that's on the
questions.
email. I'll do that as soon as
Yes.
I'm off here. Absolutely.
They want to know if your chickens actually move and who made them.
Yes, they do. They're not available right now. I got them from my friend Alan Pollock. You could look up just if you look them up, you can find them online. I haven't been able to find them in stock anywhere. It's a German company. They make lots of different movement things. Some of them actually are like really like X-rated, but I wouldn't buy those. But they've got one like of a woman beating a rug and somebody fighting a horse. But they're little chickens. Yeah, they're caffeinated and they're a little noisy. But yeah, they peck like crazy. And
Oh,
it comes as a module. You don't build it. I just took it. It's about a 2-inch diameter circle, and I built that into the scenery, and then really carefully worked the
okay.
scenic material around it so I didn't glue them down. But yeah, they peck like nuts, like crazy.
And then the real big question is there a real scrapbook?
No, no, there is not. That scrapbook is 100% a figment of PowerPoint's imagination. Although, it would be really, really fun. And I've kicked around the idea of making it. That was just it kind of, when I was, the reason I modeled the ET was it's sort of similar is I decided I wasn't going to model the Misty Mountain Lions, although that would have been cool. And I
Hmm.
was looking for a prototype that met, the Givens and Druthers back in the day from John Armstrong, what I wanted to have as a system, because I wanted realistic operation, but I didn't want a lot of stress, and I wanted what I modeled. But I'm just flipping through Model Railroader magazines one day, and I came across I think it's July 1981. If a lot of you guys will remember the Railroads You Can Model series, and it was Jim Kelly, an article on the Blue Ridge Stem Winder on the ET&WNC. It's the first time I'd ever heard of it. And I read that article and I went, "Oh my God, this is it." I told Sandy, I found my prototype. This is
Oh,
it. And so I took the same excitement in real life and decided, well, for the Vida division, let's pretend we found this scrapbook. And I gave a clinic in Hickory that was not operation based. It was more of they wanted me to do a clinic on the Vida division, just like a rail tour, a rail fan tour. So I thought, rather than just this town, this town, this town, we did it in the context of finding that scrapbook. And so no, the scrapbook does not really exist except in electrons. But maybe
oh.
it'd be cool to make.
Well, Dean, thank you very much. That was kind of awesome in a special way, and I would love to come operate on your railroad as well.
You are welcome anytime. We're first time post COVID. We've got an operating session on Friday. Short Rail McKenzie's going to be there, and he's bringing from friends from St. Louis. So you
Cool.
never know. The root beer is ready. So is the beer.
Thank you,
So,
sir.
well, thank you, sir. Sure do appreciate it.
Be safe.
You too. Thanks a lot, Speed. I really appreciate this opportunity, sir.
No worries.
Okay.
Did you want me, Marty? Marty, come back. Don't get a sandwich just yet. You want me to do another one? Okay. All right. Hey, everybody out there in Facebook. No, where are we at? Oh, we're in NMRA X-Land. This is your old buddy Lionel Strang from Modeler's Life. You just, I bet Modeler's Life, modelerslife.com. You just go there and you'll hear all kinds of podcasts. Anyways, Marty wanted me to come on here and remind you that if you like, excuse me, I need my green sunglasses for this part. He wanted me to come on here, waste your time, and tell you that if you want to see more of these NMRAX videos, just click, make sure you subscribe, and then you click this little bell icon, like you always hear Ron from Ron's Trains and Things. Hi, I'm Ron of Ron's Trains and Things. He always says, click the little bell icon, and then you get notifications after you subscribe. How much am I getting paid for this, Marty? Well, do I get a check or something? Wouldn't it be easier if they just mailed? I'm thinking it would be easier if you just mailed the videos to the individuals, but you know, Marty knows better. See ya. Modeler's Life. Follow Modeler's Life too. Bye.